welcome everybody. I'd love to introduce Katerina Georgiou from Oregon State University, who's been analyzing the dynamics and measurements of soils across the world. Welcome.
Great. Thanks, Greg, for the introduction and for the invitation. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here with you all today. I am an assistant professor in ecological engineering at Oregon State University, and I study carbon cycling and storage in soils. And so today, I'd like to share some insights on how much carbon soils can hold, and specifically a global scale assessment of the geochemical controls that drive carbon storage and vulnerability to loss in soils. So yeah, and as Greg said, feel free to jump in with any questions as we go. Okay, so first, I wanted to really highlight that soils provide many crucial ecosystem functions. And you might sort of have a more tangible field for this if you're an avid gardener, but often we kind of forget about the dirt below our feet. And so of course, soils provide functions for the provision of food, fiber, and fuel. For nutrient cycling, they provide habitat to organisms. They also provide services with regards to water purification and flood regulation, and really a number of other services with regards to construction and foundations, but also, and what I'll focus on today, they play an important role in carbon sequestration and in climate regulation. And so in this context, it's important to know that soils store and cycle an enormous amount of carbon. And so they sort of estimates to about 2 meters depth are that soil organic matter holds about 2,500 petagrams of carbon. So over 3 times what's in vegetation and over 2 times what's in the atmosphere. And every year they cycle about 60 petagrams or gigatons of carbon. That's about 5 to 6 times our annual emission. And so sort of on this order of carbon enters soils through plant material, through leaf litter and inputs from roots, and then is decomposed by microorganisms and cycled back to the atmosphere, released as CO2. And so even small changes in this massive pool of carbon and these fluxes to the atmosphere could have important implications for the global carbon cycle. Within this pool, of course, there's a number of mechanisms at play that drive the decomposition and stabilization of carbon in soils. And in particular, 2 aspects that I focus on in my work and that I'll talk about today are the role of geochemistry, and specifically of clay minerals in the soil, and of microorganisms. And these drive the stabilization and decomposition of carbon respectively. And so here we see some plant material that sort of enters the soil, and then this can be stabilized on mineral surfaces. We'll talk a lot more about that today, or decomposed by microbes and then respired to the atmosphere as CO2. I'll also note that the way that we measure and the way that we model these components in soils, especially at sort of ecosystem to global scales, we consider bulk pools. So we consider a big pool of soil microbes, or a big pool of organic carbon. But in reality, there are interactions between a diversity of individual microbes and clay minerals in the soil. And so these nonlinear interactions can lead to emergent behavior that requires sort of effective representations at larger scales in order to capture these dynamics. And so this is something else I think about, but I won't talk too much about today. And so there are still gaps in our mechanistic understanding, and certainly the way we model soils, that cause major uncertainties in soil carbon predictions. And so I just wanted to take a brief moment to sort of give an overview of my research landscape before diving into a couple of vignettes. The question I think a lot about is how soil carbon cycling and storage will respond to changes in climate management. As I alluded to already, I think about the geochemical controls on carbon stabilization in soils. the biological controls, especially with regards to soil microorganisms on decomposition, how we model these processes at a range of scales, and the representations ultimately in Earth system models, and then also using large-scale data syntheses to make benchmarks for these Earth system models, with the goal to inform policy and management through our predictive understanding. And I work, my group uses a combination of laboratory and field experiments, as well as large-scale data syntheses and modeling to address this question. And we also work at a range of scales, from the pore scale, as I mentioned, thinking about these nonlinear interactions and scaling our mechanistic understanding, to the pore scale, ecosystem scale, and ultimately the global scale. And so today I'll focus just on a couple of vignettes with regards to these geochemical controls and their representations in Earth system models at the global scale. But if anyone has interest in any of these other components, you'll know where to reach me. And yeah, I always welcome more ideas. Okay, so for what we'll talk about today, it's really important to note that that a lot of carbon has been lost from soils due to land use. So over 110 petagrams, or about 10 to 11 times our annual emissions, have been lost over the course of human history of agriculture, and especially over the last 2 centuries. And so this is a map that highlights these losses globally in a paper led by John Sanderman. And you can see large losses in major agricultural regions, especially in the US and Europe and in China. And so in part because of these losses, but also because of the co-benefits that organic carbon in soils can provide, there is a large interest in soil carbon sequestration and whether it can play an important role in mitigation. So can that debt be repaid, and also into adaptation. And with regards to adaptation, it's important to note that a number of other co-benefits with regards to air, biodiversity, water, and food can result from increasing carbon storage. And so this is a study by Bossio and colleagues that I'm just focusing on a couple of the practices that they focused on in forest, agricultural lands, and grasslands. You can see a number of land management practices and their soil carbon mitigation potential, as well as other co-benefits that they can have for air, biodiversity, water, and food. Yeah, in this context, we know that soil carbon sequestration, could play an important role in climate mitigation and certainly in adaptation, but are there limits, and can these inform priority regions for carbon management? It's important to remember that soil carbon storage is a balance of inputs and outputs. So we can this is a simple mass balance here with soil organic carbon, and we have plant inputs coming in, and then decomposition losses and erosional losses coming out. And these various pathways can be controlled by a number of environmental factors like temperature, moisture, mineralogy, pH, etc. In order to increase carbon storage in the soil, we could either increase inputs, and there are a number of such practices that can do this: cover crops, adding manure, compost, engineered crops, or decreasing outputs. For example, windbreaks and shelter belts to reduce erosion losses or improve nitrogen management. And so we can implement one or multiple of these practices in order to increase soil organic carbon, but is there an upper limit to how much carbon can be stored in soils? So it's also important to manage soils holistically with regards to both carbon storage, which you just talked about, but also function. And so in this context, it's important to note that soil organic carbon is is heterogeneous. And so it matters not only how much carbon is stored, but also how it is stored. And we have various methods that can attempt to split carbon, or organic carbon, soil organic carbon, into functionally distinct pools. And these fractions are often operationally defined either by size or density fractionation. And so two such fractions that I'll focus on today are the mineral-associated organic carbon, which, as the name suggests, is small organic particles that are bound or associated or absorbed with mineral surfaces or clay particles in the soil. And so this is typically the smaller size fraction, and they're dense because of the density. They're more dense because of the density of minerals, or particulate organic carbon, which are larger, partially decomposed plant fragments. So you can see here, small organic carbon fragments. And these pools are important because they're functionally distinct. They have different properties and different dynamics, which we'll see. And also, they're especially this mineral-associated carbon pool, which we'll focus on largely today, is a very large pool globally. So holds about 70% of the soil organic carbon in mineral soils globally, as we covered in this review paper now a couple of years ago. But it's also important because these mineral organic associations can limit access, microbial access to substrates that would be readily decomposable. And so these substrates can be stabilized or protected from decomposition. And so because of this, the mineral-associated organic carbon pool can be important for long-term carbon storage. It's more persistent, but the vulnerability to loss, especially under future conditions, it remains uncertain. And also of sort of most important for this question of how much carbon can soils hold is that this mineral-associated carbon pool, because of the finite nature of mineral surfaces in the soil, is expected to have a finite capacity that depends on the soil mineralogy and can eventually saturate. So again, I'll focus on these two pools today and talk about how the distribution of carbon between these fractions can affect the potential for soils to gain or lose carbon. And so in particular, I'll focus on a couple different vignettes, including the capacity of mineral-associated organic carbon. So I'll use this abbreviation, MAOC, mineral-associated organic carbon, and how this capacity could potentially affect further accrual. How the distribution of carbon between these two pools can affect the vulnerability of soil organic carbon, especially to warming temperatures, and then how these two pools are represented in process-based models and how these models perform globally. Okay, so first, with regards to this capacity, these two pools have distinct behavior. And so here I'm going to show just a conceptual diagram. So these fractions, mineral-associated organic carbon and particulate organic carbon, are going to be on the y-axis as a function of carbon input rate. So we expect, because of the finite nature of mineral surfaces and soils, that this mineral-associated carbon pool will saturate. As we add more and more inputs, eventually these surfaces will be functionally full, quote unquote, and this mineral-associated carbon pool will show this saturating behavior, this plateau.
So, question.
Yes.
When you say carbon input rate, are you talking about plant leaves, roots? Like, what's the input process?
Right. Great. Yeah. Yes. I'm keeping it general here, so just any carbon input rate. But you're exactly right. It could be it could be from vegetation directly, so plant leaf litter, root exudates, dead roots, but also in management settings, it could be added manure, compost. Yeah. other like crop residues. So it could be sort of either in natural ecosystems or in managed, where we can also increase that input rate directly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so, yeah, so this is the carbon input rate. And we expect that so this is sort of at steady state with a higher rate of carbon input rate, higher carbon input rate, we should have a higher mineral associated carbon at steady state. So this is not a temporal graph. It's the rate at steady state and the size of the pool at steady state. And so the mineral associated pool, because of this finite, the finite nature of mineral particles in the soil, we expect to have a plateau. Whereas for particulate organic carbon, we expect that to be able to increase sort of indefinitely with volumetric constraints. And we do see this in sort of in organic soils like wetlands and peatlands. We see much higher organic carbon concentrations, and this is largely particulate organic carbon. So this pool can increase much farther. But this mineral associated carbon pool can be more stable. And so there are sort of, different dynamics and different properties of these pools. So this mineral associated carbon pool, again, we expect this plateau, and I'll call this MOC max. So the maximum mineral associated carbon that can be reached. And so this MOC max, you can think of as the size of the bucket. So it's unique to a given soil based on its mineral content and composition. So the types and amount of clay minerals in the soil. And so this is sort of an absolute maximum, but there are other environmental factors that can play that can impact apparent plateaus. And so again, so this is this theoretical mineral capacity, MOC max. We can think of this as the size of the bucket, or really how big that pool could become compared to what that pool is currently, the mineral associated carbon. And that's driven by soil texture, which is just a way that we call the distribution of particle sizes in the soil. It's called soil texture, so clay, silt, and sand, the distribution of those size particles, and the mineralogy, which is the type of minerals. And again, it's a balance between inputs and outputs. And so we have plant inputs, and both the quantity and quality can affect the formation of this mineral associated organic carbon. And some of these plant inputs cycle through the microbial constituents in soil before forming this mineral associated carbon pool. And so this is also to highlight there can be a disconnect between plant inputs to Greg's question, sort of what we add to soil also in managed systems and what is available for this mineral associated organic carbon pool, because some of this can cycle through the microorganisms, and some of which would be respired, and then some can form mineral associated carbon. So there can be a disconnect between inputs and what's enters this mineral associated pool. And then of course there's some outputs occurring with destabilization of that organic carbon from mineral surfaces, and then subsequent decomposition by microorganisms. Okay, so I'm just going to define a few more terms here that are important when we talk about this capacity and apparent plateaus. So we'll slowly walk through this diagram, which on the left I'll have mineral associated organic carbon on the y-axis, and time since land management. And so this is a temporal diagram on this side, and then the steady state diagram that we saw previously. So mineral associated carbon at steady state as a function of carbon input rate at steady state. So say we start from a very depleted soil, we could increase carbon inputs. So change the conditions in some way that increase the carbon input rate. And and this would lead to an increase in the mineral-associated carbon, and sort of a plateau over time, and an increase here on this steady-state figure. We could again increase the conditions to increase the carbon input rate, and again see this increase in mineral-associated carbon as a function of carbon input rate and the steady state with regards to time. And so this appears to be a capacity. It is a capacity. It appears to be this sort of saturating condition. But what I want to highlight is we've only thought about carbon input rates. And so there are ways that we can change carbon output rates. And so we'll call this an effective capacity that could be limited by other factors in the soil. So say, for example, we're in an agricultural system that has tillage. And so there are losses to the atmosphere could be much larger. So we could potentially implement other practices that reduce the carbon output rate. So for example, under reduced tillage, that then allow us to store more carbon. And so we're calling this an effective capacity because it can be limited by other environmental conditions like disturbance, and we could further increase if we change the conditions again. And so now here, with decreasing the carbon output rates, I'm defining this maximum observed capacity and ultimately this theoretical mineral capacity that are really the maximum that could be stored. So no matter how we change the conditions, the environmental conditions, there should not be any more that can be stored. And the reason that I have, oh, sorry, yes.
In the context of interventions, if you start adding things like biochar or other like soil amendments, can you change the surface area and modify these dynamics?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, and we won't talk about that today, but certainly you could, yeah, so I'm considering sort of a system where the bucket, as I'll define it, is fixed. And so we're not changing the surface area that could be bound to. But you're certainly right. If we had like biochar or enhanced rock weathering, and those form secondary minerals that then can bind organic matter, then we can certainly change the size of the bucket as well. So yeah, exactly.
Cool,
so I won't talk about that today, but certainly there are ways that we can we can, so, and this might be very important, for example, as we'll see sort of in sandy soils that don't have much clay, they don't have a large amount of surface area that can form these mineral-associated organic carbon, then we could modify the soil by adding clays, for instance, in order to change the capacity. That's a great question.
Good.
Yeah, so, and so just some terminology here. So effective capacity, theoretical mineral capacity, which is ultimately the size of the bucket. And I've labeled this maximum observed capacity because, as you'll see, so we think that this maximum observed capacity is near this theoretical mineral capacity, but ultimately the way that we constrain it, we can't be sure that if we sample more soils, that we won't find a slightly higher and capacity. So we've called it a maximum observed capacity because it's conservative, and you'll see in the way that we estimate it. So so for a given soil, we can have many steady states and effective capacities under different management and climate, but only one theoretical mineral capacity, unless, as Greg said, we change the surface area of the soil. We change the mineralogy of the soil by other manipulations or management practices. And so we can think of this, again, as it's unique to a soil based on its mineral content and composition. So it's the size of the bucket. And this capacity doesn't depend on the types of inputs or the litter quality. And so there was a nice paper now over a decade ago that illustrated that. So it doesn't matter sort of what we're filling this bucket with, the size of the bucket is the size of the bucket. But of course, the types of inputs that we have could affect how quickly we approach the saturation or the filling of that capacity. And so this maximum observed capacity can be quantified given a range of conditions globally, as I'll show, but it's still an open question how close this is to the theoretical mineral capacity. Okay, so as we said, this is the way that we can see this is by these plateaus with carbon input rate. But carbon input rate is can be very difficult to measure, especially at scale. You can imagine root inputs are not easy to quantify, especially at larger scales. And so there have been some recent studies that have tried to use the total soil organic carbon as a proxy for what's available to Zorb. So just to say that again, essentially that the more soil organic carbon that you have, the more mineral associated carbon you can form up until a certain point. And so the expectation was that you might be able to see a plateau in mineral associated carbon if you plot it with the total soil organic carbon, which of course includes this mineral associated carbon. And so it's this mineral associated and the particulate. And so basically, the particulate organic carbon component of this is sort of what's available to Zorb, and so that would be what's driving the plateau. However, as you can see, so here, this is a one-to-one line, and this is a best fit line. And so what you'll see in these two different studies is this one study that there was this actually only 186 of these points were measured, and the rest were model predicted. So so that's just important to note. But there was some observed plateau in that data set as a function of soil organic carbon, whereas in this other data set, they did not observe such a plateau. And so this really led to sort of a perceived debate on whether this saturation behavior exists. But ultimately, it hinges on this quantification approach. And what this relationship really is telling us is just how much of the total soil carbon is mineral associated. And so the slope of the line is just the mineral associated carbon as a fraction of the total. And this can depend on a number of factors. So climate management, but also, as we said, mineralogy, so the clay and silt content. And so in soils that have high clay and silt content, we have generally a large amount of the total soil carbon that's mineral associated compared to sandier soils where we have a low amount of clay and silt content. And so really, it's difficult to quantify any maximum observed capacity or saturation behavior in this way. And so just to illustrate this with some data, we conducted a much larger data synthesis of over 2,200 soil observations globally, and are plotting that same relationship of mineral associated carbon on the y-axis and soil organic carbon on the x-axis. And you can see that there's, well, first, a large spread. We're not observing a particular plateau, but we can see some we can see sort of this expected result here with regards to sandier soils that have generally lower mineral associated carbon and might be sort of saturating compared to these high clay and silt soils. So again, it's difficult to quantify any plateau because it's really a continuum here with clay and silt content. And so here I've just used three bins of 0 to 33, 33 to 66, and 66 to 100 of the clay and silt percentage. But it's ultimately a continuum here. So we can't really quantify the capacity in this way. So how can we quantify this, this capacity, this maximum observed capacity, MOC max? So we already said that this should depend on the clay and silt content because that's what drives the size of the bucket. And so if we consider mineral associated organic carbon on the y-axis as a function of clay and silt, we expect this MOC max to be some maximum mineral associated organic carbon for a given clay and silt content. So again, this would be sort of the on the left would be a small size bucket, so a sandy soil that has very little clay and silt content, compared to a very clay-rich soil on the right. And points at this line would be where the bucket is full, so we've reached this maximum observed capacity, and points below this line are where it's less than full. And so really should we expect a continuum of points below this maximum. Yeah, and so if we collect data across many soils, we should be able to observe sort of this envelope where, so as we increase inputs, we would approach this maximum. So again, so if we collect lots of data across many different soil types, we could quantify this MOC max as the maximum envelope for each mineral type. As a function of clay and silt content, as is shown here, and ultimately the slope here could depend on the type of mineral. I'll talk a bit more about that. But different minerals have different surface areas and different reactivities, and so we expect that should also play an important role. And here we assume that this is linear. There are some theoretical considerations as to why that might not be the case at very high clay contents, but generally there's has not been sort of falsified that this relationship is linear, and so for simplicity, that's what we're considering here. And so we need substantial amounts of observations globally in order to derive empirically this boundary line. Okay, so to do this, we compiled now some years ago an observational data set. At that time, there was only about 1,100 soil profiles. As I showed previously, now we have over 2,200. But in this analysis, we had 1,100 observations of mineral-associated organic carbon across biomes and soil types globally. Oops. So here you can see, this is called the soil texture triangle. So with clay, silt, and sand content, where these soils in our data synthesis fall, and then mean annual precipitation, MAP, versus mean annual temperature, MAT. Again, where these observations fall, and all colored by the type of biome. And so we did a number of representativeness analyses to see how the synthesis compares to soils globally. And so here are, for instance, over 10,000 profiles, so shown in orange, from the World Soil Information Service. And really our synthesis spans a large variation in the soils in terms of their clay, silt, and sand content and their climate. There are, of course, important limitations in terms of there's fewer soils that have been sampled in tropical regions, for instance. So this is a known sort of known data gap that is being addressed, and a lot of our data comes from temperate regions, especially in North America and Europe. And so, but in general, the data synthesis spanned most of the variability that we see in soils globally. And so we can then use this data synthesis to begin to constrain this empirical boundary line. And so here I'm showing mineral-associated organic carbon on the y-axis and clay and silt on the x-axis. And so we can begin to see this sort of envelope emerge here. And this is also even more evidence, or when we start to break these soils, separate them into high activity and low activity minerals. And so we did just a coarse categorization here in soils dominated by two different types of phyllosilicate clays that have sort of different surface areas. So I'm just going to call them high activity minerals and low activity minerals. Of course, the ideal would be to have a lot more resolution, because these are not, this is a pretty coarse categorization of soils globally, but given data limitations, we weren't able to introduce more categories at that time. And also when we did, we saw some similarity with these existing categories, so we couldn't really pull them apart.
So question,
yes.
Now you're breaking this up by, if I can like coarsen it up, you're saying depending on the surface area of the mineral particles and the stickiness of them, effectively, usually predict the max. What are the, like, what's the total set of dimensions that would be relevant for this analysis?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess those are the main things, are the amount and the type, because the type differs in, as you said, stickiness and surface area. So those are sort of the main dimensions, but ultimately the way that we're grouping them is somewhat coarse, because sort of even within this, there are many different types of minerals that have different surface areas and stickinesses, if you will, like charges, and so yeah, you could potentially resolve these categories further. So with those same axes, those same dimensions. Yeah.
Right. Makes sense.
Yeah, great question. So yeah, and so yeah, we've been thinking a lot about this also, in whether we can use measurements of specific surface area or other sort of more detailed measurements of mineralogy, but ultimately those data are limited at these large scales because they're harder to measure, versus this clay and silt content is something that's readily measured, and then some characterization of the types of minerals is something that we can we can easily separate at this global scale. With these data sets, we can separate soils into these groupings. And so yeah, part of the reason that we can't resolve other properties or make additional categories is currently is data limitations, because those things are harder to measure. So yeah, so these are conservative boundaries for these two different types of minerals. So did this with a 95th quantile, so 95th percentile regression here for each of these mineral classes. And so you can see, of course, that there are some points above that. But this is sort of a conservative upper boundary. And one of the reasons we did this is because these data, and it mentioned, so it's an observational synthesis. So we went into the literature and collected basically these measurements from many papers spanning many decades, and some different methodologies as well. And so we didn't want to rely too heavily on just a couple of these top points, because there is some uncertainty related to these measurements. And so using these two relationships, so the slope for each mineral type, we can create a map of this MOC max, or this maximum observed capacity, globally. And I also say that I focus on non-permafrost mineral soils, so excluding a lot of these high latitude like permafrost regions, because we didn't have data there, and of course organic soils that we didn't focus on, like peatlands and wetlands. So then, yeah, we have this map of the maximum observed capacity in soils, in these soils globally. But as you can see, there's really a large variability of points below this maximum. So what drives this observed variability? And so this is basically we can calculate the percent saturation as the departure from this capacity. So percent saturation is, for a given soil, the mineral associated organic carbon that's observed in that soil over its the maximum for that given soil, based on its clay content and mineral type. And so we expect this percent carbon saturation to be a function of management, of depth, and climate. And so we explored a couple of these factors. So here, first with regards to management and soil depth, I'm summarizing the percent carbon saturation, again, in this synthesis of 1,100 observations globally. So the percent carbon saturation is on the y-axis of both of these figures. And then we have managed, sort of this coarse grouping of managed soils, so agricultural soils and natural. And this is quote unquote because we put the grasslands, for example, in forests. So this is mainly grasslands and forests, but of course we can have some grasslands and forests that are managed as well. But but generally this managed is much more intensively managed lands that are different from their sort of natural state. And what we saw was that these agricultural managed lands were further from saturation than the natural ecosystems. And this divergence is largely likely due to a carbon loss over time. And actually some sort of back of the envelope calculations of this difference between the managed and the natural, you get sort of a similar number to some of those, to the carbon loss number I showed as motivation in the first slide by Sanderman et al. So about 110 petagrams in agricultural soils. We can look at this a bit closer with regards to crops and forests and grasslands, where again we see that in general forests and grasslands are somewhat closer to carbon saturation than croplands. Of course, you'll note that we have some soils that are near saturation, but on average, like even these natural systems are not necessarily at saturation. And so we're not saying that it's feasible necessarily to aim for carbon saturation in all systems, but certainly we could recover some of the divergence between the crop, for instance, the managed and the natural systems. And these were in surface soils, but we can also look in deeper soils. What we see is that in general, deeper soil layers are further from saturation than surface soils. This is to a large degree expected because carbon inputs are lower with depth. You can imagine there's a lot more leaf litter, for instance, or also the types of inputs that we add in managed systems at the surface compared to in deeper layers where it's really just largely root driven or through leaching of dissolved organic carbon from the surface. And so because of the lower inputs, we're further from that maximum. But we did see that grasslands were at least slightly closer to saturation at depth than other ecosystems. And this is potentially due to their widespread sort of dense rooting and deeper rooting systems.
So question for the depth, because we have a lot of depth. Is it because of higher bulk density, so there's less like opportunity to connect also, as opposed to also like water drains down vertically and bacteria live worse when it's deeper? So like trying to get all the factors, because for interventions it starts to matter.
Yeah, I mean, so all those can matter. I mean, I think here what's really driving this difference is input rate. Is just that the inputs at depth are really just from dead like roots that are turning over or root exudation, or as you said, like dissolved organic carbon that's making its way down the profile. So yeah, the input rate is really the what's largely driving this difference.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. But of course there are other a lot of other differences at depth, and those could play a role too. I mean, of course, as you said, microorganisms differ with depth. There tend to be sort of potentially like lower activity and slower cycling, so that could affect the outputs. I mean, there's a lot to think about there, but I think this trend is largely driven from the inputs.
Yeah, okay, cool, thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so we also explored how climate plays a role, and I won't get into that today, but we did that through training, in this case, a random forest model, that explained about 78% of the variance in the data. So here you see a predicted versus observed for this data set as a function of mineral content and composition, climate, total soil organic carbon, and the vegetation or biome type. And so we use this to explore some of the relationships with regards to temperature and precipitation, and that's sort of summarized in that paper, but I won't go into that too much today because we're going to talk about temperature sort of in the next vignette anyway. But we use this also to generate a map of mineral-associated organic carbon globally, again, in these non-permafrost mineral soils. And so what we found here is that mineral-associated organic carbon constitutes about 66% of soil organic carbon in topsoils and about 70% in subsoils globally. This agrees very closely to the observational data set and to other studies as well, but just summarized sort of at a global scale. And then we can compare this map to the map of MOC max that I showed earlier to calculate the percent saturation. And so we found that in general, soils were on average 42%, had an average 42% carbon saturation in topsoils and about 21% in subsoils globally. And so that agreed, with the box plot I showed earlier as well. And you can see some sort of patterns here with regards to carbon saturation that's higher in some of these higher latitude systems and lower in some agricultural regions. But you might say, again, and also with the previous box plot, that if we're really 40% or 20% from the maximum, does it really matter? And I'd argue yes, for multiple reasons. First, with regards to models, process-based soil biogeochemical models, this maximum or MOC max is an important parameter in these models. So these are just a couple schematics. Here on the top is a schematic of a model of the Max Planck Institute for Biogeochemistry called the Commission model. And that MOC max there is called Qmax. Here it's absorption capacity. And then here, this is just a diagram showing how different models, and we'll come back to this too, represent different processes. But some select models at these ecosystem to global scales have mineral protection as a saturating absorption function. So that, again, it needs this this type of MOC max parameter. And in the past, these models were constrained using laboratory absorption experiments to measure this Qmax or MOC max. But the experiments in the lab underestimate this parameter even by an order of magnitude. And that's in part because of because a lot of these experiments are also done in sterile soils, for example, on a single mineral, like a single clay type. And so they don't have microorganisms and the diversity of minerals that exist in real life. And so, and also kinetic rates can differ in laboratory experiments than they do in the field. And so in general, those experiments underestimated this parameter. And so being able to constrain it from field observations and at these larger scales is really important for constraining these models. But from a practical perspective, it's also important because it could inform the carbon sequestration efficiency for targeted management. So carbon inputs at steady state as a function, the mineral associated carbon versus carbon inputs. We can imagine that if soils are further from carbon saturation, then they would increase more for a given change in inputs than soils that are closer to saturation. And so to check this, we conducted also a global synthesis of carbon accrual studies from 100 soil profiles, where we have carbon accrual on the y-axis as a function of carbon saturation. And what we found is this decreasing trend as a function of carbon saturation. And just to summarize, here we have accrual rates were about 3 times higher in soils at 10% carbon saturation than at 50% carbon saturation. So in general, we did see that this type of behavior as a function of carbon saturation. Of course, there's a lot of spread. These experiments had various different management practices that were implemented and in different climates, so there's a lot of spread. But I'll also say that there is some still conflicting evidence in the literature, especially from laboratory experiments, with regards to the sort of utility of this concept for informing management. So this is something that's still very much under investigation. And of course, we've really talked about this the maximum biophysical potential, but of course there are important economic and environmental limitations that can affect what is achievable in different soils. And so setting aside mitigation goals, the increasing soil carbon can have many co-benefits that are critical for adaptation and resilience. So some takeaway messages, and I'm realizing we're close to time already, but and so I'll stop here for some questions. But we have just some takeaway messages. Mineral associated carbon is a large portion of soil organic carbon, but it can eventually saturate. We can calculate that maximum based on mineral content and composition, and soils furthest from this capacity can have higher carbon accrual rates. But of course, challenges and uncertainties remain for carbon sequestration targets, especially including the carbon vulnerability under future climate conditions. I didn't realize how close to time we are. I don't know if we're constrained. Greg, you can tell me. I know we started a bit late, but
yeah, we need a few more minutes. That's fine.
Okay, because I didn't realize with the vignettes and stuff, we actually went a lot slower than I expected, and so I had another vignette that actually.
Yeah, I think we have like extra 5 minutes. It's for me. If people need to drop off, it's perfectly fine. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll just. Well, I don't want to really rush it, but I guess I'll give just a flavor of the next one, and if anyone's interested, they can reach out. But what I wanted to say is, well, actually, there's a. Okay, so I'll just take another couple minutes, and then if people need to drop off. But of course, this is recorded, so
exactly.
Watch it after and reach out with any questions. So so the next vignette I wanted to mention, and I'll try to keep this as brief as possible, is this question of carbon vulnerability to warming. And so we know that soil is warming. And it's keeping up with air temperatures. And so this is across 14 Earth system models. We can see air temperature and soils following suit. Increases in warming can cause increases in microbial activity that can stimulate CO2 respiration and cause this positive feedback that can further accelerate warming. So there's a lot of interest in studying how soils will respond to warming. And we do this in a number of ways. First, with warming experiments, and these are critical for studying site-level transient dynamics, and this is where soils are actively warmed with heating cables. For instance, at this Blodgett Forest Research Station in California, down to a meter depth, the soils have been warmed by 4 degrees Celsius over the last decade. And there are networks of such experiments across the world. But they're, of course, very costly, and there are some other caveats. And so another way that we can draw some insight is using climate gradients. So where we're using basically soils that are at a different location in space that is, for example, 4 degrees warmer, trying to control for other things that might be different across that gradient. And so this can provide insight into long-term responses. I'll note that, of course, we need to be cautious in applying this as a space for time substitution to predict transient dynamics. But in general, these these, what I'll call climatological temperature sensitivities, because they're across climate, are really important for constraining Earth system models, because they're sort of an emergent property that should be, that they should be able to capture. Okay, so climatological temperature sensitivity is essentially, here we have soil carbon on the y-axis as a semi-log as a function of temperature. And so this is the temperature sensitivity across this climate space. And we typically quantify that as the proportional decline in carbon for every 10 degrees Celsius. This is sort of analogous to something called a Q10 function that's used in biology for respiration rates or other fluxes, but here for soil carbon stocks. Okay. Yeah, and so this particular study had quantified this climatological temperature sensitivity first across all soils, and then also subset the soils into different clay contents and calculated it for these different subsets. And what they found, kind of bringing it back to the importance of clay, is that at low clay we have high temperature sensitivity, and at high clay we have low temperature sensitivity. So why is that? Well, if we go back to this mineral associated particulate carbon, the distribution of these pools differs with clay contents. And so using this, the global data product that we derived in the first part of the talk, here I'm plotting mineral associated carbon on the left and particulate carbon on the right as functions of mean annual temperature. And so we can quantify, based on the slope of this relationship, the proportional decline in carbon for every 10 degrees Celsius, so the climatological temperature sensitivity. So first across all, that's the dashed line, and then also across cool and warmer climates, less than 15 degrees Celsius and greater than 15 degrees Celsius a mean annual temperature. And what we found was that particulate carbon was on average 30% higher than mineral associated, and up to 50% higher in cooler climates. So particulate carbon had a much higher temperature sensitivity. Just to note that that was a data product, so of course we need to do various checks to ensure that we're seeing the same in our observational synthesis, and that's the case. And so what this highlights is that the apparent temperature sensitivity of soil carbon is ultimately, it's an emergent property of underlying environmental constraints and intrinsic properties. And so coming back to what we just are finding from the previous slide, the particulate organic carbon, which is sort of this, that in this desorbed state has high temperature sensitivity compared to the mineral associated carbon, which is has lower temperature sensitivity. And so the distribution between soil carbon between these pools matters, and so this is something important that models should be able to capture as well. Okay, just so very briefly here, I already there's really a large uncertainty in terrestrial carbon cycle projections, and a large amount of this comes from soil decomposition models. The way that they represent different processes differs widely, and so these are just some of such processes and how they're represented in these different models. And there's an urgent need for validating or falsifying model formulations and improving parameterizations. And there are conceptual analogs to these measurable pools, especially this mineral associated and particulate carbon, that we can use to provide additional constraints. And so generally many models, these are at the global scale. So the Earth system models used for the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, are these 9 Earth system models from the Climate Model Intercomparison Project, and then 3 other models from a separate separate model test bed. And so in general, these models are benchmarked with regards to soil carbon, total soil carbon, and so they do pretty well. But more than 2/3 of the models fall within the range of the data. But when we begin to look under the hood at these different pool distributions, so in particular, the proportion that's mineral associated across these models, we see really a much larger variability across these models. So this is something they haven't seen before. And so now we see that there's really a large spread from about 16 to 85% that's in this protected pool, compared to about 70% in the data product, and fewer than half of the models fall within the range of the data. So this is a global average. The patterns are even more striking if we look sort of at, geographically. We can see there's different geographic patterns and different averages across the globe. And if we look at latitudinal averages, again, we see that the models here in this blue underestimate the proportion of protected carbon compared to the data product. And so what this means is that models have too much carbon in these fast cycling pools, so not enough in the protected or slower cycling pools. And so they might be cycling too fast and over predicting carbon changes, both with regards to management or changes in productivity, but also with regards to temperature. And this agrees with some radiocarbon based findings as well. So in general, the Earth system models are cycling carbon too fast in the soil. In addition to these benchmarks, these new benchmarks, it's also important to note that some model representations might need updating. Some of these models that I showed represent mineral-associated carbon as sort of a passive pool that cannot really be, that kind of is sort of removed from cycling, but in reality, microbes can also interact and cause loss of that pool. So in general, we need benchmarks that allow the opportunity to improve model parameterizations and formulations. So with that,
question.
Yes.
So I mean, to what extent these models are validated against some data, but it looks like you're at least evaluating them against a much more novel, bigger, and so on data sets. What would be like a comprehensive, I guess, both validation and also tuning? Like if I were to design models, I would be targeting carbon-14, which tells you age, but it seems like I'm getting the impression that's not a normal thing.
Yeah. It is becoming more of a thing for sure. Until now, and to a large degree, all the climate model intercomparison project models that have been used by like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and others to make predictions, they've generally been benchmarked with just total soil carbon stocks and sometimes turnover. So bulk turnover rates. So like the net primary productivity over the soil organic carbon or something to that effect. So just generally these bulk stocks or turnover rates. But you're right. There's been an increasing push to first benchmark radiocarbon ages. This has not always been possible because not all of the Earth system models explicitly track radiocarbon as a tracer, and so there's really only a couple that do. And so there's been a lot of work recently on building sort of reduced order models or emulators that can introduce this radiocarbon tracer that can then be benchmarked, because it's a lot harder to go to all of these modeling teams all over the world and say, oh, you need to add radiocarbon as a tracer because we need to benchmark that. And then the other thing is these underlying pools can be benchmarked as we begin to have these large syntheses of these pools. And so, I think we need to do this in tandem, and that's kind of the next step that we've been working on is radiocarbon ages and pool distributions are important to constrain the model more.
Cool. And then in terms of the inputs, how well characterized is like net primary productivity, but also like what actually goes into the soils as opposed to what grows? That's a great question. So some of the spread that you see in these different models can certainly be because of the forcing. And so some of the inputs, like because the vegetation models differ and the climate model differ, and so this is the soil is very downstream from that. This is a great question. And so some of this spread is from the
from the forcing. And so that's why actually this biogeochemical test bed, I didn't get to go into it, but that's why this was made. So all the 3 of these models, the first, which is a very similar structure to the ones used in the CMIP, and then these other 2 that are a bit more mechanistic, these 3 models in this biogeochemical test bed have been forced with the exact same productivity, climate, et cetera. And so, so here, the forcing and the structure and the parameterization could differ. Here, it's just like the structure and parameterization that are differing.
Okay.
So there is also have been also efforts, to force the models, and we could do that if we had sort of reducer models or emulators. We could force them all with the same forcing data, productivity, and climate, in order to ensure that we're sort of better constraining the soil model itself, and not having the spread because of sort of upstream variability.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe one more. You showed like a whole it's called the phylogenetic tree of models with different features that mean different dynamics that they capture. In some sense, all the dynamics are true, just some are more or less important, presumably. So to what extent is it a matter of having a model that has all the dynamics versus a tree of dynamics per soil type, or like what would be the synthesis of this work?
Yeah. So I guess the first part of the question was in terms of like how much complexity is needed. And, we know many of these things are true, but which is important and which do we need to represent? So that is a really important question. I don't necessarily have an answer. That's something, that's very much still under debate and being worked on, and exercise with regards to scaling certain processes to see, like, are they necessary at global scales, even though we know they're important at micro scales. So that's a very valid and important question, and I think there's different modeling philosophies there too, with regards to how much complexity should we represent at these, especially at these larger scales. The second part, though, is with regards to like some of these things, and so this phylogenetic tree, some of these processes, they're actually different ways that we could represent them, and that actually highlights sort of conceptual knowledge gaps as well. And so we could represent mortality rates differently of the microorganisms, or mineral protection has been represented differently, or et cetera. And so I think again, conceptual knowledge gaps that we need sort of potentially further and targeted experiments, or we can also use the models for like more in a hypothesis testing type capacity to see, like, for the same model, if we swap out some of these different representations, how does that change dynamics? What insights can that tell us about, like, of the system? And so it kind of needs to go in both ways, I think, from experiments and models to clarify some of those knowledge gaps.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you.
That's a really great question, and sort of like the sort of forefront of what we and folks are working on. So just a couple of quick takeaways from this last part is the distribution of carbon between these pools matters for emergent properties and transient dynamics. We saw that even models that predict similar total soil carbon stocks can vary widely in their underlying pool distributions. And in general, we find that models underestimate the proportion of this protected carbon, which suggests they're potentially cycling too fast, and this has implications on dynamics. And so, kind of what we're talking about now, it's important to understand and benchmark these underlying processes to ensure that models are getting the right response for the right reasons, which is, definitely very much an ongoing challenge. So, with that, special thanks to a number of folks and my funding sources, and thanks again for inviting me and your attention.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Thanks for all the great questions.